Hello, my name is Todd Donovan. I'm a firefighter paramedic with the Derry Fire Department, and I'm also the liaison for the Derry's Community Emergency Response Team. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I just want to also thank you for your patience during this coronavirus pandemic. We were going to have this as a live audience and question and answer, but out of the abundance of caution, we decided to go ahead and cancel it for a live audience and go ahead and broadcast this live. It's also going off on Facebook, and it'll also be on YouTube. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce to you the leader of Derry's CERT team, Dr. Jay Morris.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Morris. I'm the coordinator of the Derry CERT team. And as Paramedic Donovan mentioned, we're just delighted to have you here. And we wish you were here, but given the circumstances, I'm sure you understand why we didn't want to have a live audience this evening. But we felt that the training was extremely timely. Believe it or not, this training was planned months ago, before COVID-19 and the coronavirus were even a thing. And that's because what you're about to learn about is just great stuff for any time we have a catastrophic event of some sort and folks are required to shelter in place, stay at home, and just prepare for a disruption of your regular life in terms of not being able to get to the supermarket, perhaps not having electricity for several days. And so we felt that even though we shouldn't have the training as a live training, that it was extremely timely given the pandemic that you have access to this information, and we think that you'll find it extremely interesting and helpful. Let me talk about the Derry CERT for just a minute, because one of our goals for this evening was when we decided to open this training to the public, we were hoping to have a little bit of a recruiting session as well for the Derry CERT. So the Community Emergency Response Team, or CERT, was initially started in California. I believe it was 1984. And the purpose of CERTs, and they exist all across the country, there are several even in New Hampshire and other New England communities, but during a catastrophic event, the first responders will run out of resources. They're going to need extra hands to be able to provide some level of service to the community. And the CERT was created so that we had trained citizens in the community, not first responders, but folks that had knowledge and training from professionals so that they could step in and lend a hand during a catastrophic event. And so the CERT movement has grown all of these years and is alive and well. Here in Derry, we have 30 people on our roster, all of which are very well trained. We train on a regular basis, usually monthly or more often, and we do serve the EMS, the police department, the fire department, in a number of different roles, public works perhaps, whatever is needed during a catastrophic event, we would be there to provide assistance. So that's the purpose for having a CERT team in your community. So if you have any interest in finding out more about this, we have a Facebook page, there's information on the town website, and we would love to hear from you. And we actually would invite you to come to our next training, and you would need to check on the Facebook page to find out when and where that is, but you're more than welcome to attend. If you want to find out a little bit more, you can talk to our members, and we would just love to have you, because with 30 folks, that's okay for some things, but we really would like to have a robust roster. Most of us have full-time jobs, and we never know when the call's going to come. And so it would be very rare that we would be able to mobilize all 30 people at one time. Or in the event of a long-term incident, we'd have to do some rest periods and shift work and whatnot. So it would be very important to have a very robust roster to be able to provide coverage on a long-term basis. So if you are at all interested, we have jobs and tasks that anyone can provide, It doesn't matter if you're old or young, strong or weak, we can use your help. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we would love to chat about you becoming a member of the Derry CERT. So without further ado, you didn't tune in to listen to me. You actually tuned in to listen to my counterpart in the Souhegan CERT, who is a retired Command Sergeant Major, and this guy is going to impress you. He really knows his stuff, and he's going to talk to you about emergency preparedness and all kinds of other topics that certainly are timely for right now. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Command Sergeant Major Mike Mabey.
Great. Thank you very much, Jay. I think we're supposed to do the elbow bump right now. All right. So I'm from the Souhegan CERT, which is also a Southern New Hampshire CERT team. So in addition to all of the things that Jay was just talking about that CERT teams do, another thing is this right here. We teach people how to be prepared for emergencies. And the more people in the United States that have an adequate level of preparedness for emergencies, the better off we are as a country. So my background, I've got a military background, 2 wartime deployments, 2 humanitarian assistance missions, and also because I've got this kind of Forrest Gump thing going on about always being in the wrong place at the wrong time. My office on September 11th, 2001 was 6 World Trade Center, so I was also there when terrorists hit the United States with a coordinated attack. So basically, both in the United States and overseas, I've got a great deal of experience in seeing what the world looks like when things go wrong. Now, the very first thing I want to express is that the United States is not prepared for a long-term, nationwide, widespread catastrophe. We've never actually had a long-term catastrophe in the United States. When you think about it, the biggest, baddest disaster we've ever had has either been local or regional in scale. We've never had a disaster that, fully encompassed most of the United States, at least not kind of in modern times, and we're completely unprepared for it, both on the local level, the state level, and the national level. And that's the purpose of us wanting to talk to citizens tonight, to let you know what you can do both as individuals and families and also within your community, because really preparedness has got to start grassroots from the community level. That's where we got to start. We can't wait for Washington, D.C. to tell us what to do. We need to be prepared for disasters at our level. Now, what I'm going to do tonight, really quickly, I'm going to talk about some past disasters we've seen and some of the things that we can learn from them and some real cautionary tales for the United States. Then I'm going to bring up a couple of my Souhegan CERT team members tonight. I've got Steve Nelson and Bob Coco, who are going to talk about things that you and your family and your community should be thinking about in terms of preparedness. This first slide up here, you see all of these people getting water out of, and that is actually the sewer system in Caracas, Venezuela. So if you recall, about a year ago, Venezuela was visited with a nationwide blackout. After 3 days, the people in Caracas, which is a major city in Venezuela, had to resort to going to the city sewer system to get water. Well, Venezuela is a third world country. That would never happen here. Well, it did, my friends. In Hurricane Maria, we saw that in the United States, in Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, we had people without power for months. And we all, saw it on TV. We heard about it. New Hampshire actually sent people down to Hurricane Maria. Many other states did. A matter of fact, the entire country mobilized and sent resources to Puerto Rico to try to help out with Hurricane Maria, and it was still this bad. We had people without power for months, an average of 800 days. We also, and a lot of people don't realize this, we had people without potable water for months in Puerto Rico, people drinking water from contaminated or questionable water sources because we could not get water to them. And this, remember, this is kind of a regionalized disaster, Hurricane Maria. Massive resources are available from everywhere else in the country. And oh, by the way, so the death toll in Hurricane Maria initially had been reported as being 64 people died in Hurricane Maria. Approximately a year later, that number was increased to over 3,000. So the initial 64 people that the government of Puerto Rico had been reporting were probably largely the people that died as a direct result of the storm: electrocutions, flooding, trees falling, the typical things that people die of, during the course of a hurricane. But this number of 3,000 about a year later are the number of people that died as a result of the loss of the infrastructure in Puerto Rico after Maria hit. And that's a very, very cautionary tale for the rest of the United States. And I'll be talking about that a little bit. So if anybody recalls the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, first of all, Forrest Gump moment, my office was right over there at the time. So I was in Manhattan working when this actually occurred. So the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, we had 55 million people lost their power. 45 million in the United States, 10 million in Canada. And what caused this blackout? Literally a tree branch in Ohio. So this blackout, it's a little more complicated, but the short story version of it is some untrimmed foliage in Ohio came into contact with transmission lines, electric grid transmission lines, and due to a whole series of human error, computer error, machine error, it ended up in a cascading outage of the northeastern United States. 55 million people without power from a cascading outage caused by untrimmed foliage in Ohio. Well, everybody went nuts. Congressional subpoenas are flying. How did this happen? How can we prevent it in the future? So they decide that we need to have a mandatory standard for vegetation management, transmission vegetation management, so we don't get another blackout caused like this. How long did that take? A decade to get that regulation into place. So this is probably a good place for me to back up for one moment. And we all hear the term electric grid all the time. So what is the electric grid? Well, the electric grid actually isn't just one thing, and it's not owned or controlled by one person or by the government. The electric grid is actually over 3,000 different public and private sector companies that own a little piece of the equipment used in generation, transmission, and distribution of electric power in the United States. Over 3,000 different companies, public and private sector. You've got municipal entities like municipal electric companies. You've got big electric companies that we all hear on the news and complain about when we get our electric bill. All of these companies are what comprise the electric grid in the United States. Now, the electric grid is the largest machine in the history of mankind. It is a marvel of modern technology, but of course, it started over 100 years ago, and it's been built generation by generation. And today, the electric grid as it exists is extremely vulnerable to several different types of threats, one of them being vegetation management. And by the way, if you do follow the news about out in California and the rolling blackouts that they had a couple months ago, what were those caused by? Vegetation management. So if you think we've got that right now, you might want to reconsider your position. Another blackout, which is very, very interesting, is the New York City blackout in 1977. So this was only a 24-hour blackout. So why are we so interested in a 24-hour blackout? This blackout started with a lightning strike up by the nuclear reactor at Indian Point in just north of New York City. And the nuclear reactor did what it was supposed to do, and it shut itself down. It cast New York City into blackness, into a blackout for 24 hours. During that 24-hour period, there were 1,000 fires caused by arsonists. 1,600 businesses were destroyed. 3,776 people were arrested. They had to call in the National Guard to restore order for a 24-hour blackout. So one of the cautionary tales with the 1977 blackout, Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Katrina, is people don't always behave when they get desperate or when there's a disaster. We all like to hear about the good news stories like Hurricane Harvey and the Cajun Navy going around and rescuing people off of the rooftops and cats out of trees, and it makes us feel really good as Americans. when we see these great stories about people going out and helping their neighbors. It isn't always the case. We've seen time and time again in even regional or local scale emergencies that looting and breakdowns in law and order and breakdowns in society can happen. Another one, and this is a very, very scary blackout. This is the Quebec blackout of 1989. And a lot of people, when I do this presentation all the time, a lot of people in the United States don't even really remember this because it didn't really affect us. And if you're not really terribly interested in the news up in Canada, you might have missed it. But this blackout is extremely scary because of what caused it. This was caused by a coronal mass ejection, otherwise known as a solar flare, otherwise known as space weather. And we hear about these things from time to time. So the sun, for billions of years, has been throwing off solar flares in every direction. It does it all the time. The Earth rotates around the sun, and every once in a while, the Earth is in the path of one of these coronal mass ejections. Now, normally, they can be small. They can cause interference with GPS systems and radios. If any of you are ham radio operators, you know all about electromagnetic interference, which can be caused by the sun, by solar flares and space weather. This particular solar flare was not an exceptionally large one. The last time we've had exceptionally large solar flares or big Class M solar flares that have hit the Earth were in 1859. It was known as the Carrington event, and in 1924, known as the New York Railroad Storm. Both of those were prior to the advent of the modern electric grid in the United States. This, what you're seeing here, that big transformer on the left, so in the United States, we have about 2,000 extra high voltage, very large extra high voltage transformers, and tens of thousands of large high voltage transformers. And these transformers are very, very susceptible to damage by things like a solar flare. Also, they're not manufactured in the United States anymore. So the lead time to replace one of these transformers is between a year to 18 months. So just imagine if we have a large solar storm that damages a great number of these transformers, we could have a blackout that goes for a very, very long period of time. We could be talking about weeks. We could be talking about months. We could be talking about years. The damage you see on the right-hand side of this picture is damage to the coils of the transformers caused by this solar event. But, my friends, this transformer is not in Canada. This is in Salem, New Jersey. So when this solar storm hit, we had over 100 grid-related emergencies in the United States. But these companies that comprise the electric grid in the United States were able to keep the lights on, but barely. We narrowly dodged the bullet with the 1989 storm in the United States. Now, one thing I would like to say is that these employees of all of these companies who every day are keeping our lights on are heroes, as far as I'm concerned. When we see these people working on the lines out in front of the house, the people in the control rooms who are keeping the lights on, the people working in the generation facilities, these are heroes who are keeping our lights on every day. Why do I say that? Because the entire United States is plugged into a life support system known as the electric grid. So here's another very, very scary blackout. These occurred in Ukraine in 2015 and 2016. And what's really scary about these blackouts, for those of you who don't follow the news in Ukraine, these were caused by cyber attacks believed to have originated from Russia. The cyber attackers planted malware on the Ukrainian electric grid and were able to switch it off. Now, why is this scary? Number one, we know from open sources that the U.S. electric grid has been under attack by state actors for over a decade. The Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians have all attempted getting into the U.S. electric grid. Also, the North Koreans have quite a cyber army at this point. So just from state actors and criminals, there are a lot of people. And with 3,000 companies, we're talking about 3,000 different barn doors. There's not just one thing to guard. There are a lot of ways into the electric grid. So the Ukraine electric grid was caused by the Russians planting malware on the Ukraine electric grid. In the United States, there is no requirement that malware be detected, mitigated, or removed from the electric grid. The electric grid is largely self-regulated. The big piece of the electric grid, the interstate transmission system, writes its own regulations. And there is no regulation presently that malware be detected, mitigated, or removed from the U.S. electric grid. No requirement requiring companies to do that right now. That's one thing I find very scary. And we also, if you follow, the Department of Homeland Security sends out alerts on cyber attacks all the time. There have been numerous recent examples of cyber attacks aimed at the electric industry. There's another, and we've seen this, we hear about cyber all the time, and a lot of times we might hear, well, Equifax got hacked and they got our data, Target got hacked and they got our data, some of these companies. But the real scary thing is our critical infrastructures and how vulnerable they are to cyber attack. And this has been reported. We all know about it. And yet we still find ourselves very vulnerable to cyber attack today as we stand here. Another thing that people don't think about a lot are physical attacks against the electric grid. But there are several instances where the electric grid has been physically attacked. One of the most famous incidents was in 2013 in Metcalfe, California, where a large transformer near San Jose was attacked by sniper fire. First, the assailants went in, they cut the camera wires and the alarm wires, exited out, and with precisely aimed rifle fire, took out 18 out of the 22 transformers, large transformers, completely taking that substation offline. So after that attack, again, congressional hearings, subpoenas, everything flying, and the government forced the electric industry to write a standard about physical security of the electric grid. However, that physical security standard actually applies to very few facilities on the electric grid, very few control facilities, doesn't apply to generation, it doesn't apply to the transmission lines. So the physical security standard does not apply to the entire electric grid, so just kind of bear that in mind. This is a self-regulated industry. Another kind of interesting attack, or I think it's interesting, is a pilot in Quebec took out Quebec Hydro, which is Quebec's big electric company, by air, by dropping something over transmission lines which shorted them out. And there have been hundreds of physical attacks against the U.S. electric grid since 2010. Another threat against the electric grid is the threat of an electromagnetic pulse, which is very similar to the threat I was just talking about with the solar weather, solar flares, coronal mass ejection, which collectively is all known as geomagnetic disturbance, or GMD. So an electromagnetic pulse attack is a man-made version of that. So on the one hand, we've got the sun throwing these things at us. On the other hand, if you detonate a nuclear bomb above the Earth, it creates a force called an electromagnetic pulse, which is similar to that solar flare. It can be transmitted along the transmission lines, and it can fry the equipment along the way, such as these extra high voltage transformers. So has this ever happened before? Yes, it has. In 1962, we first discovered the phenomena when we were doing nuclear airburst tests over the Johnson Atoll in the Pacific. 800 miles away in Hawaii, we found that there were effects on the electrical systems, the traffic lights, alarms going off. So it was discovered in 1962. Here we are, it's 2020. There is no standard to protect the electric grid against electromagnetic pulse. So who could do this to us? The Russians and the Chinese could do it to us. And a matter of fact, it's in their doctrine that this is how they would fight us if they ever decided to. Also, the Iranians have talked about the use of electromagnetic pulse against the United States should they ever fight us. Now, it's debatable whether or not Iran has a bomb. I can't tell you whether they do or not. There are people that believe they do, people who believe they don't. But we do know one thing about Iran. They're buddies with North Korea, and they share information with North Korea. North Korea has threatened the United States with an electromagnetic pulse attack, and they actually have the capability to do it right now, even as we speak. So, and in addition to these state actors, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, none of whom are necessarily particularly friendly with the United States at any given point in time, we also have to worry about terrorism. We know from unclassified sources that there are at least 52 missing nuclear weapons. You know that? But there are. There are at least 52 missing nuclear weapons, mostly from the United States and Russia, from planes or subs that went down. And, you know, that's just what we know from there that are classified that they just haven't told me about. But if a terrorist organization ever got a hold of a nuclear weapon, either by purchasing one somehow from North Korea or Iran, or, you know, got their hands on one of these missing nuclear weapons, you could have to worry about a terrorist electromagnetic pulse attack against the United States, which is extremely scary. We've seen what terrorists can do to the United States on 9/11, where they can do a very, very sophisticated, coordinated attack against multiple targets. So to review the threat to the power grid, and don't worry, the guys that are going to come up and give you cheerful information will be up shortly. But my job was to kind of talk about what the threats are and what could possibly cause us to have a long-term power outage or a long-term catastrophe. And remember, in most disasters, whatever they are, whether it's a hurricane, an ice storm, a cyber attack, a pandemic, one of the things we're going to have to deal with is power outages. So basically, if you're prepared for a long-term power outage, you're prepared for almost all of the types of disasters that we want people to think about being prepared for, you know, including the current one that's on all of our minds. So threats to the power grid can include weather, you know, hurricanes, ice storms, a solar flare or geomagnetic disturbance, cyber attack, terrorist attacks, earthquakes. A pandemic is listed by the Department of Energy as one of the real threats to the electric grid. Well, why is that? Well, remember, the electric grid is about 3,000 different companies. And in a pandemic, if enough people get sick and stop coming into work and you have to start shutting things down, at some point you could have either a controlled or uncontrolled cascading failure of the electric grid from a pandemic. An EMP weapon, human or computer error, or a tree branch. Now, I've done some recent analysis because this is what I do at night. I have a day job, then I come home and I analyze the threats to the electric grid. Yes, my wife agrees with you about my issues. But what I did is disturbances to the electric grid have to be reported to the Department of Energy on a form that's known as an OE-417. These are very, very difficult to find to begin with, very difficult to read. The public access to this information is just not very good. So I decided to take it upon myself to download every single one of the public reports from 2010. And what I found was weather caused 800 disturbance events in the last, decade or so. There have been 30 caused by cyber attacks, which most people that I talk to think that sounds very, very low. This is just the ones that have been reported, not necessarily all that have occurred. Physical attacks, there have been 628 physical attacks against the electric grid since 2010. 628, and these are all intentional, malicious, physical attacks intent on damaging equipment. Some of them might have been vandalism, but that's not very comforting because if a couple of 13-year-olds can get in to these transformers and damage equipment, what does that say about our preparedness for a coordinated terrorist attack against critical components of the electric grid? So we've had, quite a few physical attacks, 628 since 2010 against the electric grid. And again, the physical security standard does not apply to very much of the electric grid. It applies to very, very few facilities. And there are also, the information's so bad that actually there are 386 events that I couldn't even figure out what caused them. That's how bad the public information is. So out of the 1,940 disturbance events that were reported, I was able to find a cause for 1,554 of them, and that was the breakdown of it. So these are just some of the scary things that, the threats to the electric grid. Well, this guy is nuts up here. We're sitting here watching this, and he's talking about all these threats to the electric grid. This is crazy. Why haven't we ever heard of this? So this is what Congress, actually the Senate Homeland Security Committee, said 2 years ago in a federal report, which is publicly available. How many people in the audience, and I won't be able to see you, by show of hands, spend your time reading federal reports and watching federal hearings, congressional hearings? Okay, again, my wife would agree with you about my issues, but this is one that I did follow. And in 2017, the Senate Homeland Security Committee said a successful nuclear electromagnetic pulse attack against the United States could cause the death of approximately 90% of the American population. Similarly, a geomagnetic disturbance could have an equally devastating effect on the power grid. Are you kidding me right now? That 90% of the U.S. population, which is 327 million people the last time I checked, that's crazy. That can't possibly be the case. Well, what if it's only 40%? That's still over 100 million people if they're wrong by half. What if it's only 1%? That's still millions of people. There is no acceptable number, as far as I'm concerned, about the number of people that would be an acceptable loss if we lost the electric grid for any reason. So hopefully what I'm telling you right now is irritating you enough that you'll write to your elected officials and say, what are you doing to protect the electric grid? That would certainly help. One of my favorite quotes is from Benjamin Disraeli, and if you remember who he is, you're really old because he was like from the 1800s. What we learn from history is that we do not learn from history. What I'm telling you, there's a more modern American philosopher that says sometimes what's more dangerous than not learning from history is learning from history. And in the case of blackouts, this is exactly the case. Because as Americans, what are our experience with power outages? They last a couple days, maybe a week at the most. You know, the longest one I've actually been through is 11 days during the ice storm in 2011. But most people tend to kind of have a somebody will come and rescue us mentality. So we're going to send in utility trucks from Illinois to help put up the power lines, and you know, somebody's going to come and rescue us. Well, my friends, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, and I love saying this when there's emergency managers in the room. I've got a couple of them here because watch them wince when I say this. Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria were best case scenarios. Why were they best case scenarios? Because we were able to bring in massive resources from elsewhere in the country into the disaster area to try to help out. But what happens if substantially all of the United States is a disaster? What is the plan for a national scale disaster, such as the electric grid going down from a cyber attack or a solar flare or a pandemic? There is no plan. FEMA last year said current planning does not include any contingencies for long-term or extremely wide-scale power outages. So there is no plan. I believe this is now starting to change. There have been some provisions in the NDAA for fiscal year 2020, which start to address national scale power outages, but it's going to take a long time for the federal government and for the state governments to really catch up. In the meantime, we have to be thinking as individuals and as communities what we're going to do. Because, my friends, the cavalry is not coming. FEMA cannot airlift in water and MREs to 35,000 towns and cities in the United States. There are 35,000 towns and cities in the United States. If we have a national scale disaster, where is the cavalry coming? It is coming from your own community. So we need to identify the members of the cavalry right now and get their horses ready. So what we're going to be talking about now is preparedness on the individual and family level, but all of these also apply to the community. Your community's got to be asking the same questions. We're going to be talking about the basic 4 preparedness topics, which are food, water, shelter, and security. That is the thing that we've all got to make sure that we have thought about. We have contingency plans in place as families and as communities for any type of disaster that may come. Also, we want to consider There are differences if you live in an urban area versus a suburban area or a rural area. If you live in a house versus an apartment or a condo. One of the advantages, for example, of living in an apartment or condo is you've got people around you if there's an emergency. A disadvantage is you've got people around you if there's an emergency. There's also advantages of living in an urban area, and there are disadvantages. There are advantages in living in a rural area, and there are also disadvantages. So you need to also consider where you live and what resources might be around. And then I'm always asked this question, well, how long should we be prepared for? How long should we be prepared for? A week, 3 weeks, a month, a year? That's a decision that you've got to make for yourself. There is really no right or wrong answer, but you need to kind of take a look at what you think the risk is. Think about the longest blackout you've been in. Think about the longest blackout in the history of the U.S. down in Puerto Rico where they were without power for months. Think about the risks. Think about the types of disasters that have hit in the past and disasters that such as a solar flare. And the solar flare, this is why this is scary, my friends. Out of all of the different disasters that we've encountered, hurricanes, earthquakes, everything like that, the only one I can tell you with mathematical certainty that will happen to us is a large-scale solar flare. As I said, the last two big ones were in 1859 and in 1924. They happen approximately every 100 to 150 years. The Earth gets hit by a large-scale solar flare. We have not been hit by one, since our modern electric grid has been in place. But what I can tell you with absolute mathematical certainty is we will be hit with another large solar flare. I just can't tell you whether it's going to be 6 months from now or 10 years from now, but it will happen again. So you need to think about not only the risks you've seen in the past, but also things that could happen. And decide for yourself, what do you think is prudent? If all you have is what's in your house right now, and you have to keep your family alive for some period of time, can you do it? And if not, what steps should you be thinking about immediately to make your situation a little better? So the first person I'm going to invite up is Steve Nelson. He's from a longtime member of the Souhegan CERT team. He also has been a ham radio operator for a long time, and he told me he really didn't want me to say for how long. I'm 56 years old. He's been doing it since I was 6. Okay, so if you're good at math, sorry, Steve. So he's been in amateur radio, and in fact, when the U.S. invaded Panama, the media went to his house because he could talk to the people on the other side of the wall in Operation Just Cause to hear what was going on. That is how cool amateur radio is. So if you're not in amateur radio now, you should be because it's really cool. Steve, I will have you come up and talk about food and water.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. As Mike said, I've been an amateur radio operator for, actually, I think you're wrong, Mike. I've been almost as long as you've been alive. 55 years I've been an amateur radio operator. And the scary thing is that all the things that Mike talks about, I understand. I understand about coronal mass ejections. I understand about different things, electromagnetic pulses. I have a degree in electrical engineering, so all of this is kind of scary and was in the back of my mind until I met Mike. And then all of a sudden I said, gee, these things are a little bit scary. But we're going to give you some good news. Bob and I are going to go through a few things that you folks can do to be prepared in the case of a disaster of this type that will occur. First of all, go to the first slide here. There we go. Okay, got the right slide. All right. One more. All right, there we go. We got the right one. So anyway, I'm going to talk about food and water, and then Bob is going to talk about shelter and security. First of all, if you think about when we're all hungry, what do? We just, you go into the pantry and you take out some spaghetti and some sauce and meatballs and so on, make yourself a meal. Well, you didn't have anything in the pantry, so guess what? We're going to go to the restaurant. Pick a restaurant anywhere around here on 102, any restaurant, and we will just walk in, sit down, have a meal. Well, think about it. If the electric grid is not up, is that restaurant going to be open? Oh, but you can go to a grocery store. But think about it. Is that grocery store going to be open? It might not be. And in fact, they may have a generator, and the generator may work great for 2 weeks or a week or a couple of days. But before you know it, there's going to be a point at which you're going to have to sustain on what you have. So what I want you to do is think about your pantry. How many things do you have in that pantry that you can subsist on, that you can live on for, say, the next week, 2 weeks, month, 2 months, 6 months? Actually, there is a lot of things we can do. And I'm going to start over here. And this is just a these are canned yams, if you like canned yams. And these are green beans. And on each of these cans, there's a date that says Best Buy. Now, we look at these cans and you say, well, once they, quote, expire, then we're going to just toss them out. But Best Buy, what it means is that if you eat it after that date, it's probably not going to taste the greatest, but it's still going to be good. It's still going to give you food, going to give you sustenance. So what you can do when you go grocery shopping, instead of just buying 1 can of green beans, say you buy 4 or 6 cans of green beans, and you line them up. And then the next time you go shopping, maybe you buy a couple more cans of green beans. You can do this with a number of different canned goods. And what you'll do is sooner or later you'll have a stockpile of things you can use. Now, I don't recommend you have 200 cans of green beans because you're not going to like green beans after a while. But you can do this with a number of different foods. And what this will do is this will actually give you a stockpile that you can rely on in case you cannot go to the store. And you can do this with a number of different types of canned goods. You can also get a little more creative on the whole thing, and you can go to different companies. Amazon has a lot of these types of foods. These are long-term foods that you can purchase. And these foods, some of them will last for 10 years, 20 years. Some of them are 30 years. And in fact, we have right here, we have whole eggs. I believe those probably, I think the expiration on that is probably 10 years, 10 or 15 years. We have beef. That's about the same, and I think there's some chicken here that may be as much as 30 years. So a number of these different cans will have different lifetimes. But these can be purchased. Believe me, they're not cheap. Some of these can cost as much as $30 a can or more. What you want to do, if you would like to do something like this and store these, you need to go on the internet and find where you can get the best price. And what you will find, and I just went on the internet a couple days ago to look at some of these things, I found that a lot of them were out of stock. And I think some of the things that are occurring in the world today are probably making a run on this type of food. But it will be available. I'm sure there's more in the pipeline, and these will soon be available again if they're not available already. But these are a great way to stockpile things for a long period of time. You also can do it yourself. And this is a Mylar bag, and basically this has rice in it. So what you can do is put the rice in here, and you put a oxygen absorber in the bag, and then you seal it. You can just use a regular iron that you can seal the top of it with, and basically you now have something that you want to date it, as Mike has on here. It says rice 4/29/18. So this has been since April 29th, 2018. So it's been around a while, and this will last for quite some time, probably 10 years or more. And what you want to do is put it in a container such as this. This happens to be a market basket bucket, and it has a cover on it that screws on. You want to make sure you keep this as dry as possible and kind of seal the container. And very simple to do. You can do it with an iron, the oxygen absorber, and the Mylar bag. And we have a bucket full of rice here, and it's very good to eat after a while. Also, you want to think about how you're going to cook things. Some folks think about cooking or boiling something. And when you go to boil something, what you have to think about is if you're using a gas grill, that's not going to boil things quite so well because there's a lot of flame that's very distributed. What you want to use is something like a cooking stove I have down here on the floor. And again, you can power that with a small propane tank or can use a rather large propane tank with a regulator on it. You can also use something of this nature. Again, you can use that to cook your food. This is again, has a small propane tank on it, and you can put some water to cook rice or whatever you need to cook on here. Also, this is a small folding stove that can be used with sterno. This is something you can buy at any of the stores. Home Depot even has that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing that you really want to think about when it comes to food. Now, of course, there's always a garden. Back in the Depression, when folks wanted food, what they did was they used to plant a garden. And that was always a great way to raise your own food. Now, obviously, if you're in the wintertime, something like this occurs in the wintertime, it's difficult to do that. But during the summer, the spring, the fall, certainly you can plant a garden. Most people will buy, if you want to generate your own seeds, you're best off buying heirloom seeds and heirloom plants in order to generate seeds that you can plant again. So you could generate it's actually a self-generating garden. And you can plant all sorts of things, and many of you out there may have had gardens and still do. There also was aquaponics, and that's something that a few folks have, Mike included, and that's where you actually grow the vegetables in water. And there are ways of using a fish tank in order to feed the vegetables. And that's getting a little advanced on being prepared. So that's probably about all you can do with food. What you want to do is, if you need electricity, you certainly can use a solar cells, and you can run a solar system to generate some small amount of electricity that can power a few small things. And that's just about it on the food side. The next thing I'm going to talk about is water, because that's something really important. And if you think about it, the water that comes out of your tap, you just turn the tap on, and water will just immediately come out. All right, water. Just turn on the tap, and there it is. And if you think about it, every time we wash our cars, we're using potable water. We water our gardens, we're using potable water. For almost anything that we do, we take a shower, we brush our teeth, everything, we're using all this potable water, and you just turn the tap and it comes out. But if there's a long-term electric grid outage, is that tap going to be available? Are the pumps going to run to get the water to our house? Is our pump, if we have a well, going to run to get the water up into our house? Maybe not. So what you have to think about is, where am I going to get water if there's a long-term power outage? One of the things you can do, if for some reason the water stops coming into your house, the first thing you probably want to do, if you have municipal water, is to shut off that water tap that goes coming into the house. Mainly because you don't want that water to be siphoned out, because the water that's in your system can be used to fill a bucket or fill a container. You also have water in your water heaters, if you have a water heater. Some of these instant water heaters don't have very much water in them, but the piping certainly does. But a water heater may have as much as 40 gallons of water in it. So you can drain that water out. Again, that's potable water, and you can use that. If you know something's coming, you can also fill up your bathtub. I clean it first, but you can fill up your bathtub and use that water for cooking, or you can use it for, for using in a toilet or something like that. I'm not sure I'd drink that, but you certainly could do that. You also have to think about what other sources of water you have. Now, what you could do is you could go down to the stream that's in back of your house and say, well, gee, I got plenty of water down there. But you ought to be careful when you do that, because there's many waterborne diseases. And if you think about it, many third world countries have waterborne diseases that create sickness in these countries. And what you don't want to do is just drink the water directly out of the stream. Things like Giardia are maybe in the water and could make you very, very sick. And that's one thing you don't want to have happen. So what do we do in that situation? Well, first of all, if you want to store water, this is a potable water container. And this container can be used to store water for usually, I think probably 5 to 10 years you could leave it in here. It's specifically made for water. And if you don't want to store the water, if you run out of stored water and you need to try to get some more water, let's say out of the stream, you can use a water filtration system. And there's a number of water filtration systems out there. This happens to be a microfilter purifier system, which can be used to filter water. If there's a lot of sediment in it, you might want to run it through, you can run it just through a coffee filter to get some of the sediment out, but then I'd run it through one of these microfilters. Some of these you can just hang up on a hook and let the water run down through, and then over a course of time, you'll have some potable water at the bottom. You can also treat the water, and that can be, in some cases, a little dicey, but there's a number of things that can be used to treat water. You can use iodine, and I actually have personally tasted water that was treated with iodine. It's not the greatest, but when you're thirsty, it does work. There's also bleach. The bad thing about bleach is that over the course of time, bleach degrades. So after about a year, it may not be any good to use in water to purify water. What you can use is calcium hypochlorite, which is basically pool shock. That's something that will stay for a long period of time, and it allows you, again, to purify water. On the FEMA website, there's a lot of different information. Also on our CERT website, there's information on how to use some of those products. Also, jumping back to getting water, a lot of you will have wells. So you say, well, I don't have electricity. I can't get water out of my well. So what do I do? Well, this thing is, it's called a dipper? Baler bucket. Okay, I've heard different things, but baler bucket. What it is it has a hook on the end of it, and you take the, thank you, Mike. you take the top off the well, and you drop that down the well. Of course, you have a rope on the top. And this valve down here is a one-way valve. So when it gets down into the water, it allows water to fill that baler bucket right up to the top. And then as you pull it up, the valve closes, and you can get water right out of the well. It's a pretty unique thing. It's really PVC pipe with the one-way valve and a little hook on the top. So it's pretty simple. You can buy them. Amazon has them. A number of different supply houses will have these type of things. Or you could try building something yourself if you've got a one-way valve. But again, that's a way of getting water out of your system in case you need it. So that's just, the other way you can do is you can boil water, but you have to boil water for probably about 5 or 10 minutes to assure that you've gotten all the impurities, you've boiled away all the impurities out of it. So that's just about it. That's all we have relative to water, and I think the next person up is going to be Bob, and Bob is going to talk about shelter. They got it. All right. Shelter.
Well, shelter is something we all need. In this example here, I'm not going to suggest that I'm a carpenter and that the first thing you do is repair. I'm going to talk about some of the more common things that happen to all of us. Could you flip that one? Oh, back again. This is a pretty common sight in New England. And I guess I'm becoming a believer. It's only taken 70 years or so, but I'm becoming a believer in this being prepared thing. Mike scared the bejeebus out of you, most likely, and that's his job. But I'm here to tell you that you're part way there already. You may not know it, but you've already got a good start on surviving. And I'm going to point out some of the things that I think that are working in your favor. The next one. The one thing that's not working in your favor right now is you live in an electric house. Um, Everything in your house is geared around electricity, supplying the power to do things for you, heat, everything. Next one, please. And you may say, well, wait a second here. I've got a pellet stove. Well, if you have a pellet stove to keep warm, because heat is one of the things that we worry about in New England, the problem is it requires electricity for both the auger to bring the pellets in to burn and the blower to actually maximize the effect of the burning pellets. Just to the right of that is a typical furnace. These all require power, whether it's a gas or oil burning furnace. So when the electricity goes out, you've got a little bit of a problem here. The good news is, though, that you've probably already experienced this, and you've found a way around it during these power outages, especially in the winter. One of the ways to do this is to keep electricity flowing. There's a most common way here in New England is to have a portable generator, and that's a good thing. And it can power a portion of your house. There are bigger ones that can power almost all of your house, but remember, it does require some kind of a source like gasoline or some are diesel or propane. And incidentally, that can be dangerous too, so you want to be careful. For instance, I noticed in this picture, it's supposed to be about 15 feet away from your house. This one maybe is 4 feet, and the garage door is open. So carbon monoxide is a real problem, so you want to be careful of that. But certainly, a lot of us have taken advantage of generators to help us out in these crises. So we do have water. We do have a stove to cook on, and we can get through some of these emergencies for a day, a week. Another one is a whole house generator, which is what you see down below here, powered by propane. And that's an excellent choice too. But unfortunately, what will probably happen is when you need this thing, your propane tank will be a quarter full. And by the way, a whole house generator will consume about 500 gallons of propane a week. Now, the last I looked, propane was $2.95 a gallon, so you'll be going through about $1,500 in a week of propane. And then you need to get it refilled. And during an emergency, you may not be the first on the list to get refilled, the propane. I know our fire department probably is, I hope they're first on the list to get their propane tank filled. Next slide, please. This is my house, and this is my grid. And you're probably saying, Bob, get real. I can't, this is not a reasonable expenditure. And a year ago, I would have said that too. Things have changed quite a bit recently with solar power. I have 22 panels here, and it's 7.2 kilowatt hours, I believe I can produce. And this is a good solution, as long as the sun's shining. But if you haven't made plans for when the sun's not shining, it's not such a great solution. Next slide, please. Down in my basement, I have a battery, and this stores electricity as it's generated. What I don't use in the house gets put down into this battery, and basically my house every day now runs all night on the battery, and I have plenty left over in the morning. But without the battery, in an emergency, you would basically be at the mercy of the sunshine. Now, also, solar panels nowadays, in a rainstorm, I can still generate about 400 watts in a rainstorm, which sounds incredible, but it does happen. I looked into getting a whole house generator. That's what I wanted, is a whole house generator. But when I got through pricing everything out, and with the federal tax credits that I got, which was last year was 30%, this year is 26% of your total expenditure you can get in a tax credit. it became a reasonable thing to look at. And if you have another source of electricity other than the grid, and by the way, make sure that it's installed correctly. What you don't want to do is having, when the grid stops producing electricity, you don't want power going back out in the grid, because that'll kill someone. That'll kill the line workers. And it's a very important thing to remember. It must be set up by a professional, and there must be an automatic trip back and forth. Mine is automatic. I don't do a thing. The nice thing about solar, too, is that unlike a generator, it requires no maintenance. None. There's no maintenance at all to this. And the life expectancy is guaranteed at 10 years. And also, I produce more electricity than I can use, so I sell some back to the grid. You don't get a lot of money for that, but it's something. The next one, please. The thing is, whether you have a generator to solve your power problem, solar panel, whatever you have, you've got to conserve your electricity. Though it says whole house generator, you really don't want to run everything in your house on it. So what I have is I have several panels that control my electricity, and one controls just when the power goes out what I send power to. And I send power to the critical things. I send power for my water pump. I want water. I send power to the furnace, and that's only going to last as long as I have heating oil. But, hopefully I don't have a quarter tank of heating oil, and I have more than that, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But I also send power to things like my internet, because I do want to have a source of news and information coming in, and I have other circuits that I can keep the radio going, so in times of emergency I can get some information. And I can also charge my cell phones. The next one, please. So when the oil goes out and I have no more oil and I can't get the oil truck to come in, I've had this solution all along, and a lot of you probably have it too, or you have a fireplace. A wood-burning stove, this one I've had for 31 years. Works great, but it needs fuel. Next slide. And here's my fuel. For me, I always have 6 cords of wood minimum when October comes. And you have to plan for that. You have to plan to have a lot on hand. What you don't want to do in an emergency is go out there and cut a tree down and start feeding green wood into anything. Number one, it's going to be hard to burn. Number two, if it does burn, you're going to have a big creosote problem, which can cause your house to burn down, which won't be a lot of fun. So you've got to be careful of that. No, we'll leave it at that. Just hang on to that one. There are a couple other things that we've brought here that I want to explain. If you don't have another source of electricity, you want to be prepared for some kind of lighting. There's all sorts of great lanterns out there right now that you can buy. They require some kind of fuel, either white gas. Some require white gas or batteries. So you want to make sure, if it's batteries, that you do have a stock of batteries. But again, I believe that a lot of us have learned this lesson over the course of time when we've lost electricity before for smaller periods of time. At least you know where your flashlight is, because you've had to go find it in the dark, and you probably put it somewhere where when it's dark you know how to find it more easily. And batteries, nowadays I keep a stock of batteries on hand, not just for when I have to set the clocks forward to back and change the smoke alarms, which is something that is critical, along with the carbon monoxide detectors that you need. And you need them battery operated, as well as if they're already electrically wired in, that you have a backup battery as well, so when the power goes out, you need that to protect your house during these critical times too. There are other things. Speaking of solar, here's a 6-pack of lanterns that I think probably cost $15 somewhere around there, and you can get these now at at a lot of the discount stores. And these are great, and you're saying, well, I don't want to have my wok lit up just because the power's out. No, you probably don't. But if you put it out during the day, you bring it in at night, and you got the grandkids or the kids at home, and the lights, there's no lights, and the sun goes down, these come on, and there's enough light to last them all night. So they can read their comic books, or you can read your own book, but you can keep going. Also, if you take a look now, you don't have to buy one of these big fancy systems like I have. For a couple $100, you can buy panels that will operate a lot of smaller appliances or electrical or electronic things, as well as charging your phones and whatnot. There are other things. Oh, also lighters. You're going to need a source of fire for a lot of different things, so make sure you have some of these Bic lighters or whatnot on hand. They're cheap and easy to get. There's a lot of things that are going to happen if the power goes out and you can't get your furnace to work. You want to stay warm. This, believe it or not, is a sleeping bag. Granted, it's a 60-degree bag, but in your house, that's maybe all you need for a couple nights, depending on what the weather is. Steve and I have been in Scouts for eons, and I spent more years than I care to remember trying to get my feet into one of those little mummy bags. So I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore, and I got this big bag. I want to tell you, it's great. It's a 0-degree bag, and if worse comes to worse, this will keep me pretty warm. If it doesn't keep me warm, I can put this inside it, and I guarantee you I can go down to 20 below zero. It's not a fun way to live necessarily, but I want to tell you this bag is pretty comfortable and it will keep you warm. So that's what you can do in an emergency. There was one other thing I did. I took one of these, I think I got 2 of these for $15, and I thought, I wonder what else I can do with this. This is a spotlight, solar powered. I got into the wiring and I put a USB wire in it, and this is a little charger. This charger, when it's full, will charge my cell phone at least twice. So, you know, if you like playing around with things, and I do, this was a nifty little thing to try. Communications is very important. And there's all sorts of emergency radios that you can get weather information on, which is very important. You can get information about the news, what's happening in a pandemic. If the lights go out during a pandemic, you still may want to know, oh, where is the mass inoculation center? You know, and by the way, in CERT, we help support that activity. You can hear it on this. There's all sorts of different emergency radios that are available. I haven't been a ham operator for 51 years. In fact, Steve taught me, and I took the course and passed. But ham radios, we have found out in our CERT activities, come in very handy. They have a reach that normal handheld radios don't have, and they come in very handy during emergencies. So that is what I wanted to talk about shelter. And the next thing I want to talk about is security. Flip the next slide. Well, 911, I guess, is a backup plan. But what happens if you go to contact 911 and you can't? And that's a real possibility. How do we contact 911? We'll dial the phone. There are cases where you can't do that. There are cases where your landline doesn't work, for those of us who still have a landline. Cell phones can be very picky. I remember during the marathon bombing, I was in Boston at the time, and no cell phones are working. They shut them all off because they're afraid of that. That could happen. There could be an emergency that requires that kind of thing to be silenced for safety for everybody. There's a cell phone tower near my house. It has two, I think it's 1,000-gallon tanks of propane to keep that cell tower going. And I've always wondered if lightning struck those towers, I guess would hear about it pretty quick. But that cell tower would be out of business. And it is not uncommon for a cell tower to go down. So you've got to be wary of that. Next slide. So there's a pamphlet out here about, in fact, I think it's a booklet about put out by FEMA about a zombie attack, and it's a joke, but it's to get people to think about it. Am I saying you should be prepared for a zombie attack? No, probably not a zombie attack, but Mike did bring up a good point. The emergencies can bring out the best in us, and it can also bring out the worst in us. And unfortunately, that's happened. It's happened in Katrina. It's happened in several other emergencies. So we need to be prepared to protect and secure our families, ourselves, and our property. Next slide. Well, one way, of course, would be with a weapon. And it's a personal choice. I was in the Army. I was trained. And I know center body mass is where you aim. Well, I tell you the truth, I could not do that right now. I could back then when there was a mission to do that. But if you aim a gun at someone, I think any police officer would tell you that, you must be prepared physically, mentally, morally, financially to kill that person. I'm not. And some people are, and that's the way they feel, and that's fine. And that's their right to protect themselves. Next slide. But I think there are other ways, and I know there are other ways. One way is I prefer to get a bunch of like people together. In CERT, we're a bunch of like people. Matter of fact, this is our CERT training manual. And in the training manual, it talks about most everything we talked about here tonight. And I know that if Steve was my next door neighbor, he's not, but he's close. If Steve was my next door neighbor, I wouldn't worry too much about him breaking into my house to steal my food or drink my water, because he'd be prepared too. And that's our mission, is to help people be prepared. This is my go bag for CERT, and in it, there's a lot of, and we all have our little go bag, and in it we're prepared for a lot of different emergencies. Neighborhood Watch, I don't have one in my neighborhood yet, but it's something I think that is interesting and helps to bring people together and keep people prepared for emergencies and things. Next slide. I know this is from the town of Amherst. You can have the police come. We have a program, security inspections, and they'll come and they'll look at your house and tell you about security and things that might need improvement, things that you're doing right. And I think this is a good way to start as well. But it's a starting point. And I guess that's what we're all talking here tonight about, just to get started. And you've probably got a head start on some of these things. Another way to, if there is danger of people invading your household, the one thing is that people that do that are basically cowards. And I won't do this, but this is a horn, a klaxon. It's meant for boats. If I did this right now, I think we'd probably blow them off the air, so I won't do it. But this is a very important thing because it scares people. And basically, as I said, most burglars are cowards. Here's another thing. I'll just do it lightly. It's a whistle. And that draws attention. They don't want attention drawn to them. So that's another thing you can be thinking about. And I think that another thing you might want to think about is, if you're not in a community where everybody's a CERT member and everybody's prepared, after a while, and I'm not talking a day or two, after a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, if things get testy, you may not want to advertise that you're doing well. you may want to go into the stealth mode a little bit, and it's something you may want to think about. You don't want to broadcast too much that that everything's just fine, because everything's not just fine with other people, and sometimes people take advantage of your knowing what to do. So you may want to go into the stealth mode a bit. Oh, there's one other thing. You click the next slide. Dogs. Now, maybe not this dog. Well, maybe this dog without the tennis balls. But dogs are a great security measure. Basically, a person who doesn't know your dog has no clue that your dog just wants to lick you, lick the person that's in front of them. And the barking is an annoyance too. So dogs are a great protection device. Not sure about cats, but dogs I'm pretty sure about. The next one. Here's another thing I'm going to point out, because someone in the fire department in Amherst made me a believer. And they said, you know, Bob, the one thing that we really don't like when we come out to a house is if the garage is on fire. They said, if the house is on fire, that's cool. We can handle that. But you never know about the garage. The next one. This is my shed in the backyard. And after that, I bought this box. My shed is 50 feet away from the house. Want to hit the next slide? And that's what's inside it. This was all inside my garage. There's kerosene, there's diesel, there's gasoline, and that's a propane tank full right there. So if the shed's on fire, I'll just tell everybody, stand back, just let it go. It won't bother the house any. And I call this Bob's Bomb. And if you may remember, next slide. Oh, guess it's not there. Nope. Well, back a few years ago in New York City, you may remember there was a person who went by an SUV, and there was smoke coming out of the SUV. And it was in Times Square, and there was no one around. They looked in the window, and in the back was pretty much what you see here. There were four-gallon containers of gasoline and 3 propane tanks. And they figured that would have taken out a good part of Times Square if it all went off together. So my thing about security as far as your garage go, make it easier on yourself and make it easier on the firefighters, and look around and move some of that stuff away so that you'll be secure and you won't be harming yourself. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Mike.
Okay, so as I think I got on here. So as Bob said, this is a starting point, and preparedness is actually not a destination, it's a journey. So the important thing is to start thinking about food, water, shelter, security. Start thinking about the fact that even though we think we're in the United States and we think we're safe, we're actually not. We've seen terrorist strikes against the United States. We've seen all kinds of threats to the electric grid. We're presently facing a worldwide pandemic. So it is healthy for us to not be complacent and not always think that we're safe just because, you know, we're in a little town in New Hampshire in the United States and nothing can get us. We should always be thinking about the fact that we are responsible to protect our families and protect our communities. What I like to say is we're not preparing for the world we live in, we're preparing for the world we find ourselves in. And we're hoping that tonight you've gotten at least some ideas and some things that you can start. Up on our website for Souhegan CERT, which is SouheganCivilDefense.org, and we'll have a link on the YouTube video where you can get to it. We have an emergency preparedness checklist that you can download, and it has a combination of things from both FEMA, from the EPA on water purification, and also on our decades and decades of emergency preparedness experience within Souhegan CERT. We put together this one-page checklist that if you go through this, it will get you very, very prepared for all kinds of disasters that could possibly happen. There are also all kinds of resources in addition to our website, SouheganCivilDefense.org. FEMA's website has checklists you can download, and also the all-time greatest federal government website ever is the Center for Disease Control's Zombie Pandemic Preparedness website. This is so cool. This is an actual federal government website and a federal government document right here, if we're able to pan the camera in, which is the Zombie Pandemic Preparedness Handbook. Now, were they serious about this? No, I don't think any of us really believes there's going to be a zombie pandemic. But the bottom line is you can make preparedness a little fun. It really doesn't matter if you're preparing for a hurricane, a pandemic, an ice storm, a cyber attack on the electric grid, or a zombie pandemic. The steps are all the same: food, water, shelter, and security. And with that, we would be happy to answer any questions. We have a few people in the audience. We would be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Okay. No questions? Okay. Thank you very much for your time. We hope you've enjoyed this video. And what we would like you to do is get with your family and get with your neighbors and show them this video. It's going to be up on the Derry TV Facebook page. It's also going to be up on YouTube. And pretty soon, we'll have it up both on Derry's Facebook and website and SouheganCivilDefense.org up on our website, our Twitter, our Facebook, everything like that. We'll have this up and available so you can show it to your family, show it to your neighbors, start talking to your loved ones about emergency preparedness. And we've got to start being more prepared as communities if we want to make the country stronger and more resilient against all of these threats that we presently face. Thank you very much for your time, and we appreciate your efforts to be prepared in your communities.